Welcome everybody to choosing the best yarn for your project. My name is Dana and I am with Fave Crafts. I will be emceeing today's class.
Oops. Sorry.
No problem. I am joined by Marie Segaris. We've got a couple of housekeeping things and introductions and all sorts of good stuff before we dive in. So if you aren't familiar with Fave Crafts is a website that shares free craft tutorials from all over the internet. We have a variety of free email newsletters broken down by interest, like Easy Does Knit and Everyday Crochet, for example. You can sign up for any of our free newsletters at favecrafts.com. We are recording this class and we'll be emailing out a copy of the recording tomorrow. So keep an eye on your inbox for an email from Zoom with that recording in about 24 hours. And you can use the Q&A feature to ask questions or the chat. Either one I'll be monitoring. So feel free to drop in your questions as you have them. And hopefully we get to all of them by the end of the hour. And then Marie, if you want to pop over to the second slide.
Sure. So I wanted to share that you're welcome to sign up for my newsletter, and I have two different versions, which you can see when you get to the sign up page. One is a little more specific for crocheters, and one is for knitters. And both of those will include a newsletter that comes to you every week, sharing free patterns from around the internet, the latest stuff going on at Underground Crafter, and gives you access to my subscriber vault, which includes some exclusive free patterns as well as some discounts from other designers and craft companies that are, again, exclusive for Underground Crafter readers. So hopefully you'll enjoy the workshop today, and that'll be something that you want to sign up for. So I guess we'll kick off from there.
That sounds great. I can introduce you with a fancy introduction.
Yeah,
if you
go
would like,
for it.
Marie.
I
Yay!
like being fancy. Why not?
Yay! So do I. Awesome. Marie Segaris is the proprietress of Underground Crafter. Marie shares crochet, knitting, and sewing patterns, crafty tutorials, recipes, and more creative inspiration on her blog. She also hosts virtual make-alongs throughout the year. You may be wondering about the Underground Crafter name. Marie isn't part of a secret society of crafters, though that would be pretty cool, but she got her start crocheting and knitting underground while commuting on New York City's subway system. These days, she commutes above ground via bus in Burlington, Vermont. Welcome, Marie.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm really excited to see so many people here. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll feel more confident in choosing yarn for your projects. So for those of us, whether you've been crocheting or knitting for a long time, or you just started, the quantity and types of yarn today there's so many more than there used to be in the past. So whereas, when I was younger, it was pretty easy to, use one yarn all the time and be really familiar with it. Now there's just so many different types, so many different brands. Within each brand, there's many different options. And so because of that, it's actually, it's exciting. You can get all these different kinds of yarn much easier than you could in the past. But the downside is that it can be a little bit challenging to find a yarn that, is exactly what you're looking for. So that's basically what we're going to focus on today. And if you have questions as we're going along, just drop them in the chat. I'm not going to be looking at the chat, but Dana will let me know if there's questions there. So first of all, here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk just generally about yarn substitution. We're going to talk about the properties of different fibers. We're going to talk about yarn weight, and then we're going to talk about multicolor yarn. And then we'll talk about some other things that may factor in as you're deciding to substitute a yarn. So those first four are like the most obvious things to think about, but there's other things to think about as well. And then we'll talk about different resources for yarn substitution and answer any questions that you might have. So when you think about yarn, right, and substituting yarn, what are the types of things that you have to think about? Well, so first of all, there's the fiber, and the fiber is basically the material that the yarn is made of. And there's one whole set of fibers that are from animals, right? There's one whole set of fibers that are from plants, and then there's one whole set of fibers that are synthetic or man-made or woman made. And all of those types of fibers you can get a yarn that's 100% in any one type of those fibers, or you can get a yarn that is a blend and it combines maybe the human made fibers, the synthetic fibers with an animal fiber, with a plant fiber. So when you think about yarn substitution, one of the things to think about with the yarn fiber is the fiber affects a few different things, which is one is breathability, another is cost, another is how the yarn drapes. So those are just some of the things to think about. The next piece here is yarn weight. And when I say yarn weight, I'm not talking about how heavy the yarn is. Okay, so I'm not talking about like if it's 100 grams or 200 grams. I'm talking actually about the thickness of the yarn. And in the US, we have something called the Craft Yarn Council, which tries to standardize these things. And they go from a 0 weight of yarn, which is also known as a lace weight or a fingering weight, all the way up to a 7 weight of yarn, which is also known as a jumbo or a roving weight. And so as the yarn gets thicker, that can change different things about your project as well. And then when we think about multicolor yarns, when I was younger, the only type of multicolor yarn we had was something called variegated, which is sort of like little splotches of different colors. But now a lot of yarns have something called self-striping or long color repeats. In other words, that the pieces, the sections of each color are really long. And so by using this particular type of yarn, you can create the effect of stripes without changing colors. So when you think about multicolor yarn, believe it or not, it can actually impact the amount of yarn needed. So for example, using a self-striping yarn, you may have to add a second ball of yarn at some point, and you'll want to preserve the color sequence. So you may have to not use some part of the ball. So if you're doing that for, let's say, a garment, you'll actually need more multicolor yarn than if you substituted a solid color. So some of the other considerations are things called ply. And this gets a little confusing because in the UK and Australia, the ply is often described as part of the yarn weight, what we would call the yarn weight here in the US and Canada. Whereas when I'm talking about ply now, I'm talking about how the yarn is twisted. So how many twists are in the yarn. There's also care instructions. So is this something that you have to hand wash? Is it something that has to be dry cleaned? Is it something that you can throw in the washing machine and dryer? All of that will affect the type of yarns you want to use. And then, of course, nobody likes to talk about it, but it's the cost. Okay. So when you think about yarn, for some of us, certain yarns are just not affordable or they're not available in our country. So the shipping costs are really high. So those are some of the other considerations. So we're going to sort of work through all of those today. So now we're going to talk first about the yarn fibers. Okay, so the key thing to remember here is if you're working from a pattern from a designer that has picked a yarn with specific yarn fibers, you want to try with your substitute to choose the same fibers if possible. That way they'll have the same behavior. So whatever reason that they chose that particular fiber, whether it was for the drape, the breathability, the elasticity, you'll get the same type of thing if you choose the same type of fiber. So elasticity, what is that? It's basically how easily the yarn rebounds. In other words, how the project retains its original shape. So when we think about certain fibers. So today I'm wearing a t-shirt, right? And probably all of us at home have that t-shirt that has like the wrinkly neck, or we've seen that t-shirt before. And that's because cotton as a fiber tends to stretch a lot. And so it doesn't rebound usually to its original shape, whereas wool really does, right? So if we think about switching to a different fiber, we want to make one that is also elastic. The next thing to think about is the breathability and the insulation. So that's the degree to which the yarn lets your body breathe. and it retains heat or cold. Okay, so if we think about this, when a lot of the synthetic yarns compared to the natural fibers that are animal or plant fibers are much less breathable. So what that means is, for example, if you're making a garment for the summer, it's going to keep your sweat in. It's not going to let as much air in and out, right? So that's going to affect how the garment is worn over time. Insulation is basically, does it keep you warm, right? So when we think about things for winter wear, we want to usually have something that is going to have a good insulation. It's going to retain our body heat, right? And keep out the cold. So those are some other factors to think about with fibers. So let's talk about our natural fibers, okay? And these are alphabetical. They're not in order of amazingness or anything. So we're going to talk through these different fibers. So the first thing is that in general, like I just said earlier, natural fibers are more breathable usually than synthetic fibers. So here are some of the more common natural fibers that you may see out there. So alpacas, they're like the easiest because they're actually from alpacas. There isn't some other secret name for the animal. If you haven't seen alpacas, they're members of the camelid family, so they're related distantly to camels. Alpaca yarn is very, very soft and lightweight. Okay, but which is wonderful, yay, good in the plus category, but it's also very, very inelastic. So it tends to stretch and grow and doesn't retain its original shape over time. It's great for retaining heat, right? So these alpacas, many of them live in the mountain. So if we're using, um, you know, uh, yarn that comes from, you know, their hair that they're insulating themselves with, right? It's going to be good at retaining heat and it's going to be water resistant, right? Because they live in these rainy mountains. It does not have something called lanolin, which is a waxy secretion that some animals have, which some people are really heavily allergic to. So that's good. So because of that, it's considered hypoallergenic, and it usually is something that people with sensitive skin can wear. Um, so because of the softness, the retaining heat, the water resistant, not having lanolin, being so lightweight, so you could make a large garment and it's not going to feel really heavy and weigh you down, for example. People love alpaca, right? So sometimes, though, you'll see it combined with other yarns and other fibers, I should say. And the reason for that is usually it's combined with another fiber that's going to do something called increase the stitch memory. The stitch memory is how much the stitch looks like what you originally crocheted or knit over time. So that, and it will make it more elastic, meaning it's going to be more likely to bounce back. Alpaca that is 100% alpaca, it does have to be gently hand washed, but if it is combined with other fibers, sometimes you can also wash it in the machine. So Dana, I don't know if there's any questions so far. Please let me know if there are. So now we're going to go to Angora. So that's a yarn that comes from rabbits. It's also very, very soft. It's supposed to be 7 times warmer than wool, so really warm. Also tends to stretch quite a bit, and it's a little bit slippery. So people may find that they need to use textured knitting needles, or you may need to change your crochet hook to get a good grasp on the yarn. It also stains pretty easily. So think about that as you're choosing projects that you might make with Angora. Just like the alpaca, it's usually combined with other fibers, both to decrease the cost. Because when you think about the size of a rabbit, right, it's pretty small. So how much yarn could you realistically get from one rabbit? So obviously it's more expensive than some other fibers, right? So the combination of the other fibers is often to lower the cost, but it can also be to reduce that stretch because Angora is another one that is pretty inelastic and it stretches out. So in general, it can be hand washed, but some yarns will recommend dry cleaning instead. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of the care. So another one to think about is bamboo. And this is a plant fiber. It comes from bamboo plants. It's generally considered one of the more eco-friendly and sustainable yarns because to grow bamboo requires minimal resources compared to other plants. It's very smooth and silky, extremely breathable. So it's great for summer stuff, right? It's not irritating typically to sensitive skin, and it can wick moisture. And what that means is it can kind of move the moisture off your skin and dry really quickly. So if you're thinking about using it for garments that you might wear in the warmer weather, that's a really great benefit of using bamboo. But there's always a but, right? It can be less durable than some other yarns. And because of that, it's often combined with other fibers, both to lower the cost and to improve the strength. And most bamboo yarns are going to require hand washing. So cashmere is another animal fiber. It comes from goats. It has really great drape and it tends to get softer over time. So it's one of those things where, the first time you make it, it's going to be soft and then it's just going to be softer and softer and more cozy over time. It's very insulating as well. Again, we can think of a lot of goats that may live in mountains and other really cold areas, and it's very, very lightweight. It tends to have a little halo, which is like a little puffy thing that is around the yarn, so it's not perfectly smooth. And so because of that, it doesn't do great with friction and it has a tendency to pill. So if you think about the type of things you were going to make with it, like I personally wouldn't wear like cashmere shorts, right? Because I would imagine that as my thighs are, rubbing together, that friction is going to make like a big pile of pills. But it may be better for other types of garments that are not going to be exposed to so much friction. Um, it's less breathable than some of the other natural fibers, and it's also fairly expensive compared to other natural fibers. And it's usually something that requires dry cleaning. So now coming to cotton. Now, most of us are just familiar with cotton in our daily lives before we started crocheting or knitting, after we started crocheting or knitting. So it's a relatively affordable plant fiber. It's very smooth. It has really good stitch definition. So the stitches you make tend to be more visible. They kind of retain that specific look. So, it works well with kind of fancy stitch combinations that might be really interesting to look at. It's very, very breathable and it's very strong, but super inelastic, like I was saying about the wrinkly t-shirt neck, right? So it doesn't always bounce back after it's been stretched. Some cotton it has a chemical treatment called mercerization. So it's called mercerized cotton. That makes it look kind of shinier, and it also increases the strength and reduces the shrinkage and resists mildew. Um, and cotton of all types is usually machine washable. Some of the mercerized cottons, they do have different washing directions because of the chemical treatment. So mohair is another fiber that is also from goats. Very lightweight as well, breathable, very insulating of warmth. Very, very high degree of elasticity. So it springs right back to its original shape and doesn't tend to sag, which is great. It has a little bit of a fuzzy texture. And so sometimes people find that difficult to see their stitches while they're working. And it also makes it a little bit harder if you have to rip back your project if you made a mistake. So, be cautious with those mohair patterns. Um, and some people have skin sensitivities to mohair, so it can irritate some people's skin. It's also very soft, but can be more on the expensive side. And most of it is something that should be hand washed, but some can be machine washed on the gentle cycle. So silk is another fiber from, I guess, the animal world, the insect world. I'm not sure, actually. I'm bad at my creature selection. Maybe somebody knows for sure, but it's from silkworms. And pun intended, it's one of the silkiest yarns out there. Okay, so it's great for wearing in cold and warm temperature. So it regulates temperature. So it's perfect for all kinds of extremes, very strong. Um, it can be a bit staticky, so that can be a problem depending on the dryness of the climate where you might be located. It's not very elastic, so because of that, for heavy or large projects, it will tend to get distorted. So it's not a great choice for those type of projects usually. It's one of the most expensive fibers out there, and it usually has to be either hand washed or dry cleans, depending on what it's combined with. And it has to be stored a little bit more carefully because a lot of moths would love to dine on your silk project. So because of that, you don't see a lot of people making big, huge projects out of silk, but it's a really kind of a nice treat if you can find some. And then for our natural fibers, we're going to end on wool, which next to cotton is probably the natural fiber that most of us are the most familiar with. It's a fairly affordable natural fiber. It's from sheep. Great, great stitch definition again. So you can use all those complicated stitch patterns and it really pops. Very elastic. So it really comes back to itself after you wash it, after you wear it. Um, so projects kind of spring back to shape year after year, and that's why probably a lot of us have, grandma's sweater that she knit us, wool sweater from when way back when, and it's still, the same size, even if maybe we're a different size now. Um, it's very breathable, also very insulating. And when it's wet, wool will wick moisture and retain heat. So it's great to wear in the cold. It's great to wear in wet climates. Now, remember back when we were talking about alpaca, I mentioned this thing called lanolin. So, wool does have lanolin, and some people are very sensitive to it and have an allergic reaction. And that's why when people say they're allergic to wool, and then other people say things like, oh, but this wool isn't itchy, it's not necessarily about the itchiness, it's about the lanolin in the fiber. So, and speaking of itchiness, there's a huge range in softness in wool. So there's some wool that is so soft, right? You just want to like cuddle up with it, rub it in your face, lay in it, all the stuff, right? And then there's also some that's really hard, and that type of wool that's a little stiffer and scratchier is really more suited for outerwear. So it's something you would wear over another layer of clothing. So just as an example, a lot of this is based on the breed of the sheep. So merino wool is very soft and smooth, but it's more prone to pilling than other types of wool. And most wool needs to be hand washed, but some wools have been chemically treated. They're usually called superwash or washable wool, and those can be machine washed without shrinking or felting. And wool is also popular with the moths, so it has to be stored a little bit more carefully. So I'm going to move on to the synthetic fibers. Some of the most
Hey,
common ones that, oh,
I'm sorry, could I stop you there? We have a bunch of questions about,
oh, yeah, go for it.
yeah, I thought maybe if you want to go back a slide, a lot of the questions are just specific related to the variety of
Gotcha.
yarns discussed. So, yeah, so the first question is from, let's see, I'll start with it's Victoria. Okay, Victoria is asking, is alpaca yarn expensive? Also, is it durable? And where can you purchase it in the United States?
Yeah, so alpaca yarn, on the scale of natural fibers, it's usually more expensive than wool, but less expensive than, cashmere, mohair, silk. You can purchase it in a lot of different yarn stores. So if you have a local yarn store near you, you can most likely purchase alpaca. 100% alpaca yarn if or at a like a farmer's market if you live in an area that has alpacas, which some of us do. If you live in an area that you only have big box stores, most of the big box stores will carry an alpaca blend yarn. So there are quite a few yarns from the large yarn companies that blend alpaca, usually with acrylic, and mostly that is because to make it machine washable and also to make it a little more elastic so it doesn't stretch out as much. So those are probably the best places to buy it. What else?
Let's see. What yarn is least likely to pill?
So again, a lot of that, I would say, the one that is, the ones that are more likely to pill, I kind of talked through those. Most yarns, if they're of good quality and they're not a specific fiber that tends to pill a lot, are not going to pill. It has to do with how you care for them. So personally, myself, when a project says it can be machine washed, I don't just hurl it into the wash with everything else, right? And so the biggest thing that's going to cause pills if you are machine washing is what else is in that wash. So if you have like towels in with your crochet and knit, forget it. You are getting pills, right? But if you put it in with like jeans or if you put them in, a smaller project like in a lingerie bag or something that protects it a little bit from the friction in the wash, you can really reduce the pilling even with the fiber that tends to pill more. So I would think about the pilling is mostly about how you're washing and wearing it, more so than the yarn itself, except for those ones that I mentioned that do tend to pill more.
Okay, awesome. Michelle is asking, this has to do with the mercerized cotton. Does the
Hmm.
mercerization, does it wash off over time?
Um, so it usually says something like, if you read up about it, after like 30 washes or something. But in my experience of using projects that are made with mercerized cotton over time, I haven't, my eye has not seen that it's gone. I guess it is probably at some point. I think if you have a really delicate type of project, most likely you're not washing it very frequently because of that. So it could last, a very long time. Um, you might just spot clean it rather than, for example, throwing it in the wash.
Hey. And then Jenny just had a comment that I thought was interesting. She said, I heard that superwash can still felt.
So the superwash is like the mercerization where it's set for a period of time. I'm making up this number because it's going to depend on the treatment, but let's say 30 washes or something like that. So technically, after that number of washes, the chemical treatment will come off. And so technically, yes, it could probably felt. I have not personally experienced this. So I can't speak to that. I haven't heard of anyone that's had that experience, but I mean, on the plane of reality, it seems to me feasible that it could happen. I think one of the things I learned actually from quilting that I'll share here is a lot of us tend to wash our projects probably a little bit too often. So if you think about a quilt, you're not going to wash it, every week when you wash your sheets, right? You're going to wash it a couple of times, um, you know, less frequently, right? Because it is handmade and it also is just not going to withstand being in a machine in that kind of, agitation and then, going in the dryer and all that kind of stuff. So I think if you are concerned, like if you have a type of project that you plan to wash a lot, like let's say a baby blanket, which probably will get washed a lot, you probably would say, maybe the wool, if you think you're going to wash it, every week or every couple of days, then maybe you might want to consider, do I really trust that this particular wool won't felt by, year 2 or year 3 kind of thing. So I think those are the kind of considerations we have to take in when I said other, right? Like, how are we going to take care of this project? If we're going to say, you know what, I will wear this wool hat for 10 years, but I'm going to hand wash it or I'm not going to put it in the dryer or all these things, then you're not going to worry about it. But if it's something that you're really trying to make it easy care, most likely you're going to want to look for another yarn that is going to be able to endure that type of washing.
Okay, awesome. I think I'll leave it at that for
Okay,
now. Yeah,
cool. All right,
thanks.
so we will jump back to the synthetic fibers, right? So these are the, man or woman made fibers. So they're usually made, so acrylic, nylon, and polyester are all made from petrochemicals. And so those have kind of a common chemical background. So when we think about acrylic, pretty lightweight. It retains colors really well. So it's usually acrylic yarns come in a huge range of colors. It is the most widely available synthetic fiber and it's very affordable. So many of us have probably worked with acrylic before. It was originally designed to substitute for wool. So because of that, acrylic yarn in a lot of ways mimics wool, right? So we have some really soft ones, we have some scratchier, stiffer ones. It isn't breathable though, like wool, but it does retain its shape and it retains warmth. So it's better for cold weather garments than for warm weather garments because it keeps in the heat, but it doesn't, let you breathe out the heat, right? It can retain odors as well. And so again, going back to the summer garments, not always the best idea, but it's so durable, very easy to care for, easy to machine, wash, and dry. You do have to be cautious with very high heats because acrylic can melt. So you want to keep it, remove it promptly from the dryer, dry it on low, not on very high temperatures. Nylon is also known as polyamide. It's not usually 100% nylon yarn. It's usually added to other fibers to increase the strength, add shine, and make them more elastic. So it's extremely durable and it resists wrinkling as well. So like acrylic, it's also sensitive to high temperatures in the dryer, but otherwise very easy to care for. It can be machine washed and dried. You see it a lot in sock yarn to help the socks bounce back, right, to their original shape. So polyester is a quick drying, very durable, resistant to wrinkling also. Not great stitch definition compared to other yarns, so you're going to probably want to use a more simpler stitch pattern. The textures can vary from scratchy to fluffy novelty yarns, and it's often combined with other fibers, usually machine washable, but not always machine dryable, so you do have to check the label. So rayon is a heavily processed cellulose or plant fiber. So there's so many different types of processing that rayon can be really kind of different from one brand to another because each of the different types of processing changes it up a little bit. But generally speaking, it's more breathable, adds cooling properties, silkiness, and smoothness to the yarns it's combined with. It's pretty slippery though, and somewhat inelastic, so it can tend to be harder to knit or crochet with, and it will probably stretch out over time. Some varieties of rayon are called viscose and tensile, so those are different names that also mean rayon. And you always want to check the label because, like I said, there's a lot of different care instructions because there's different types. Most can be machine washed and dried, but not all. Questions about the synthetic fibers before we move along? Oops.
Few questions that are, one of them's kind of about the synthetic fibers. I'm trying to
Yep.
understand. Cece, jump in the comments if anything I'm saying is confusing. But Cece is asking about, like, I think blends, so like cotton
Okay.
wool or
Uh-huh.
wool that is actually acrylic, or like
Yeah.
wool and acrylic blends. Could you speak to those blends a little bit, Marie?
Yeah, so like we've been talking about, right? There's no fiber that's 100% perfect for every situation. So usually what a lot of the companies do is they try to combine fibers to give the finished yarn kind of, the best of all worlds, right? So as the example with alpaca, right? We know it's going to stretch out. So they'll try to combine it with a yarn that's very elastic, like wool, that isn't going to stretch out. And that helps that project will still be warm. It'll still be resistant to, um, all these things that alpaca resists, like water and everything, but it'll be a little bit less stretchy. So usually when you usually and it depends, but usually when you see the blend fibers, they're trying to get different traits of different fibers so that the finished project is easier to deal with in some way. Either it doesn't stretch as much, it's not going to shrink in the wash, or it can be washed in the machine, things like that. So the challenge for us, right, is substituting fibers. So way back at the beginning, I said if the pattern recommends a specific yarn, I try to get a yarn like that because I assume the designer had some reason for picking that yarn, right? Like either it's going to have a characteristic that make sense for this project. So like for a baby blanket, it's easy to wash. That's my most important thing, right? So when you go to substitute, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to find the right things to substitute, you want to find something that's similar to what they said. So if they're using a blend, if you can, you probably want to consider using a blend too, because there's probably a good reason for that particular blend that they chose.
Okay, awesome. Cece's saying she's seeing products that label the yarn as wool, but it's actually cotton. So like seeing on the label, like
Oh, okay.
the
So in
cotton
some
wool. Yeah.
countries, people refer to yarn as wool. So it's like if you're in the US, sometimes people call soda soda, and some people call it pop, and some people call it Coke, right? And they all mean soda, even though Coke is a specific brand. You might have a ginger ale Coke, for example, if you live in that part of the country. So in some countries, when they call wool, they mean yarn. So yeah, they would then say cotton wool, like you're saying, acrylic wool, things like that. So if that's not a country that you're from, I would say maybe try not to order yarn from there. Maybe it's like their way of describing it is probably unclear for you to understand, and you may not get the yarn that you're expecting. If you're from that country, you probably know what they mean, I'm guessing. So,
Awesome. We have 5 questions. If we
okay.
maybe rapid fire them and then do our intermission because it's already
Yep, we're
11.
getting close.
Yeah. And Cece had another clarification question, which is the difference between yarn and thread. Is there a difference? They can be the same thickness, right?
Yeah, so some yarns are as thin as thread. Typically, when you have heard of crochet cotton thread, it's usually a mercerized cotton of specific um, widths or yarn weights. And so that is just a name for those types of threads, but they are the same thicknesses as many types of yarn. So they are technically a yarn. They're not the same as, for example, the thread you might use on your sewing machine or for hand sewing. So they are considered yarns. They're just a specific type of thinner yarns that are usually mercerized cotton, but not always.
Cute. All right. Louise was asking, she's got 2 questions. One is, do you know offhand the best place in Canada to buy yarn online?
I don't, but there is a designer very popular in Canada, Umbaka Design Crochet, and I know she has a blog post about buying yarn in Canada, so you might want to try that one.
Awesome. Okay. Michelle is asking, is the same true for synthetics regarding pilling as for the natural fibers?
So most of the synthetics do not, they're designed not to pill as much as the natural fibers would. But again, like I was talking about with how you're caring for it. So if you're washing a polyester thing in the machine, frequently drying it, you have other stuff in the wash with it, it's possible that it's gonna pill, even though it's sort of designed not to pill as much.
Okay.
Yep.
Destiny's asking, which of the synthetic yarns have the best stretch?
So most of them don't have tons of, when you say stretch, you mean coming back to the same size, like being elastic, or you mean stretching out and just growing and growing forever? If you mean being stretching and coming back to their shape, like being more elastic, most of the synthetic yarns are quite elastic. That's kind of why they were designed. Nylon is used a lot for that purpose. It adds that it specifically adds more of that. So a lot of times you see it added into yarns, for example, sock yarn, because socks are going to have to be stretched out a lot and they need to go back to their original shape.
Awesome. All right, last question before the intermission. Louise is asking, what do you think is the best yarn for a baby blanket?
Yeah, so a baby blanket yarn to me has to be something you can wash and dry easily. I don't know too many baby parents who want to hand wash things and dry them with special instructions and things like that. So I think the most common is probably acrylic for all the reasons we talked about before. For parents that don't like synthetic fibers, which they are out there, I would say 100% cotton, even though it does stretch. Usually, if you put it in the dryer, it'll sort of shrink a little, so it'll kind of counteract the stretching, and it'll, end up close enough to the original shape. And then there are quite a few baby yarns that are 50-50 acrylic and cotton. With the polyester yarns, I would not use a polyester yarn I've never tried before for a baby blanket, because they do vary quite a bit in how easily they wash and dry. So if it's one that you've used before and you feel like it's durable enough, I would, that's also an option.
All right. Fantastic.
All right.
Okay.
Oops.
Yeah, we can do a short intermission now. I'm just going to talk about our upcoming classes as well as a special offer from our digital magazine we give everybody who attends our classes. So coming up in 2 weeks is Learn to Crochet the Alpine Stitch in 3 colors. So you'll learn not just how to crochet that stitch, but how to change colors, carrying the yarn up the sides so that you don't have as many ends to weave in. So yeah, that's coming up in 2 weeks. And then Marie, if you want to go to the next slide. 2 weeks after that, so in 4 weeks, we have 3-dimensional fabric flowers. That is a new class taught by the designer from I Am So Crazy. Her name is Jessie, and she's going to teach you how to use like scrap fabric left over from projects to create some beautiful fabric flowers like the one in this image here. So that's in 2 weeks. You can sign up, sorry, that's in 4 weeks. You can sign up for any of our upcoming classes at favecrafts.eventbrite.com. If they're already full, when you go to that class page on Eventbrite, you can click through to the Zoom link, which is there too, and you can sign up there. And I'll also drop all these links in the chat so you guys have them. And then last, as a thank you for attending today's class, any new subscribers to any of our digital magazines can get an annual subscription for just $5 US. Our digital magazines are ilikecrochet.com, ilikeknitting.com, and welikesewing.com. And what you get with that annual subscription is 6 digitally published issues each year, plus some special collections that are like seasonal, or brought together in other different ways, different topics. You also get access to all of the previously published patterns ever for these magazines. So we just hit a decade for I Like Knitting, for example. So you get 10 years worth of premium tech edited knitting patterns when you do that introductory offer for the $5 US. So it's the advantage of a digital product. Any of those links, you can go to the website, ilikeknitting.com/virtual24, and same with ilikecrochet.com/virtual24. Put all those links in the chat as well. All right, Marie, back to you.
And I'm biased, but I love all these magazines, so I recommend them. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the yarn weight. And again, when you're substituting, you want to choose the same thickness as the designer used when possible. So if we go through the different yarn weights, they start at the 0 weight, which is also called lace. This can also be called fingering or 2-ply yarn. Typically, you're going to use a 1.5 to 2.25 millimeter needle or hook. The next one is super fine. You may also know this as sock, fingering, baby, 3-ply or 4-ply yarn. And typically, you're going to use a 2.25 to 3.5 millimeter needle or hook. Number 2, fine yarn, you may also know as sport, baby, 4-ply or 5-ply yarn, and you're going to usually use a 3.25 to 4.5 millimeter needle or hook. Number 3, light, is also known as double knitting or DK, or light worsted or 8-ply, and that's a 3.75 to 5.5 millimeter needle or hook typically. Number 4, medium, often known as worsted, Aran, Afghan weight, 10-ply. Usually you're using a 4.5 to 6.5 millimeter needle or hook. And then number 5 is bulky, which is also known as chunky craft, rug, 12-ply or 14-ply yarn, and you're usually going to use a 5.5 to 9 millimeter needle or hook. And then super bulky, which is number 6, also known as super chunky, roving, or 16-ply, and that usually uses an 8 to 15 millimeter needle or hook. Number 7 is jumbo, which is also known as roving, and that's usually using a hook bigger than 12.75 millimeters. And so these different weights, they get bigger. But each one is a range. So I hear a lot of people saying, oh, medium weight yarn isn't the same weight it was before. There's no one thickness that encompasses all of medium weight yarns. It's all of them are a range. So you find that different brands, different fibers, the range is different. So for example, a lot of novelty yarns like eyelash yarns are often considered to be bulky or super bulky because the eyelash itself is very thick. But when you're knitting or crocheting with it, it tends to flatten. And so you may feel like you're working with a double knitting or a sport weight yarn. And so even though the yarn itself is thicker, the way it works when it's being knit or crocheted will affect how thick it feels to you. So now we're on to multicolor yarn. So, when possible, when you're substituting, either choose solid colors or the same type of multicolor yarn if you can. So, let's talk about the three main types. Semi-solids are typically a hand-dyed yarn, and they are the easiest multicolor yarns to substitute successfully. They have very subtle variations in color, and from a distance, they usually look like a solid color yarn. But up close, you start to realize, oh, okay, this isn't just all the same red. Here it's a lighter red, here it's a darker red, and you start to see all these beautiful intricacies of the color that make the project really bold and interesting when you get closer. Variegated yarns have really short color repeats. Each section of color is pretty short, so the changes are much more dramatic. And variegated yarns sometimes have an effect which people call pooling, where you get large blocks of one color that are sort of distributed in unusual ways. So some people, crocheters and knitters, uh, get distressed by pooling because they have trouble predicting when these blocks of colors will happen. And so because of that, they avoid variegated yarns. Other crocheters and knitters love pooling, and they actually do specific patterns that encourage pooling and things like that. So kind of figure out which one you are before you get too much substitution with a variegated yarn. Self-striping yarns, as I said earlier, they're also called self-patterning or long color repeat yarns. These have more gradual changes in color. The length of each color is longer. So basically what they look like is stripes, but you don't have to weave in as many ends because you're not changing the yarn. But you'll always need extra yarn if you're substituting another type of yarn with a self-striping yarn. So let's say the pattern used multiple solid colors that they made stripes with. You're going to need probably more yarn than what they said you'll need for each section. And the reason is because to maintain the striping pattern, you'll have to usually start the yarn not at the beginning of the skein, but at another point where the color matches up. And so there's typically some waste, some yarn that you're not going to use at all for the project. So now the other considerations, right? And we talked about these before. So in the UK and Australia, ply can refer to the yarn weight or thickness, but here I'm talking about the number of strands that are twisted together. So in general, if you've never used a yarn before, it's hard to know how many plies it has. But the hardest yarn to work with uh, in terms of plies is what's called a single ply yarn. So they have a halo usually, which is like the kind of furry outside of the yarn, so it's not totally smooth. And because they're only one ply, they're not as durable and they are a little bit more prone to pilling. So if you make a mistake, they're harder to rip back. Sometimes the yarn will actually break as you're pulling it out. So you want to avoid substituting with a single ply yarn unless that's what the original pattern called for. So, you can use single ply yarns and they're fun for a lot of projects, but if you're sort of substituting, I wouldn't randomly throw in a single ply yarn. We also talked a lot about care instructions. So when thinking about a project for yourself, obviously you know your own preferences, but when you're gifting a project, think about, how's the person going to use it? I hear so many people saying, "Oh, I took all this time, I made this project for someone, they never used it." Well, they don't know how to clean it usually, or they're afraid to clean it. And if they're not going to dry clean it or hand wash it or whatever, please give them something that, they're going to fits into their lifestyle, which may be machine washing. Um, Put up, what is that? So the put up is kind of how the yarn shows up. So the most common ways are a ball, which is like a sort of circular thing that's wound around. Balls are not great for yarn because they tend to stretch the yarn. And if you think about what we've talked about, the different types of fibers, some of the fibers don't go back to their original shape when they're stretched. So I would not want, for example, a ball of alpaca yarn. Um, you can also think about a skein, which is sort of a twist that looks like a figure eight, um, and a hank, right? Which is also kind of like that, or a cake, which is a new way that people see sort of a flattened version. So a hank is in a twist, and it's usually more seen in indie yarns or luxury yarns. A cake, it's a flattened bundle of yarn, usually oval, and a ball is usually hand wound and spherical. And so if you don't have a yarn winder or a Swift, you may find that dealing with yarn on a hank is actually difficult. So also with multicolor yarns, if they're on a hank, it's really, you know, depending, it's better to see them in a cake or in a skein. That'll give you a better idea of what the yarn's going to look like. And then cost, right? Sometimes, certain yarns are out of our budget, or for a specific project, they're out of our project. So we may need to substitute for a more affordable type of yarn. So I'm going to share two popular resources for substituting yarns. The first one is a website called Yarn Sub. So you would go to that site and you enter the yarn that you're trying to substitute. So let's say the pattern calls for, company X, yarn Y. You type that in and it'll give you other types of yarns that are similar, and it has kind of a rating of how similar they are. Another place you can look is in the Ravelry yarn database. You have to sign in there. You have to have a free sign in, and you can see similar yarns. So you can search by, the yarn fiber, the thickness, and so on. And you can see more reviews from people that have used the yarn, which I think is really helpful, as well as projects they've made with the yarn, which is also quite helpful. So those are the substitutes. Any last questions before we go?
We have one from Jill. She says, can you talk about yarn by gram weight? A lot of
Mm-hmm.
yarn or patterns do not provide yardage anymore, just weight. How do you figure out how much you will need?
Yeah. So when a pattern lists just the gram weight, if it does not list also the yarn weight, so it doesn't say like 100 grams of bulky yarn, it just says 100 grams, I would find that pattern really unhelpful. I'll be totally honest with you. And I don't think there's any way you could accurately calculate how much yarn you might need. Um, Typically, because the yarn weights, by this I mean the lace weight, the medium weight, not the gram or ounce weight. Those weights are a range, right? So you may find, for example, a medium weight yarn is usually in the range of about 170 to 230 yards per 100 grams, right? So if you knew the yarn weight and you had the grams, you could sort of calculate, well, I would need about this much grams to substitute. But if they didn't give you both of those pieces of information, you really couldn't guess. Um, when I'm substituting with something I haven't worked with that designer before, I would always add 20%. So if they say you need, 500 yards, right? I would say, well, I'm going to get 600 yards just to be on the safe side. So it's 20% more than the 500 yards. And for those of you that are math phobia people, you just multiply by 1.2, and that'll give you the amount.
Michelle's just asking about the materials list for the class. She says, why did we need to bring a skein of yarn with us? Are we going to look at our label?
Well, so I was kind of thinking some of you might have questions based off of your label, and that's why I suggested people bring, but it seemed like most of the questions were more general. So if people have questions about things they're seeing on their label, we can answer them now. We have a couple of minutes. So usually the label tells you the weight, recommended needle or hook. Sometimes it gives you a typical stitches per inch, should tell you the fiber content, and some yarn, usually the smaller yarn companies may only tell you the number of grams and not the number of yards, which is not a great practice, but it does happen. And then ideally, it will also tell you how to care for the yarn. So some instructions on yarn, caring for yarn.
Michelle is also asking, is there a central place to go for calculating different weights? I
You
assume that
mean,
means grams to ounces.
yeah, I mean, if you want to convert grams to ounces, most web browsers have like a calculator that will do that for you. So if you search, grams to ounces, it will come up usually with a calculator, and then you can enter that information.
Yeah, I've just been Googling. I've been like, what is
Yeah,
3.5
but you can do it
ounces?
on with other search engines also. So yeah, usually whichever search engine you have will have some way of doing that for you.
Oh, good. Okay. Lois is asking, I see that care instructions use symbols. How can I understand these?
Oh, yes. So, yeah, some of them you'll probably get familiar with over time, but the best way for that is in going into your favorite search engine and look for laundry care symbols. These are international symbols. They're the same across every country. So, that's not like a special one for this yarn company, thank goodness, like everything else seems to be. So once you have one of those charts to print out, you can always refer back to it. And I use that all the time because I get confused with one of them if it means it's supposed to be washed or not washed. Some of the instructions don't apply to home care. So some of them are about dry cleaning and which type of solvents can be used. But there's also ones that tell you if it can be hand washed, machine washed, at what temperature, and if it can be tumble dry or not.
Awesome. Okay, a couple more questions coming in. Victoria's asking, how important is it to match lot numbers?
So when you think about trying to work on the same project with the same yarn, it depends a lot on what the project is, how important it is to match the lot. So the lot is also known as the color dye lot number. So that means they were dyed at the same time, so the yarn color should be consistent. Some yarns are a no dye lot yarn, meaning they're so convinced that their consistency is always the same that you can pick up any yarn and it will always be the same. So for me, if it's a project like Granny Squares, I don't worry about it as much because the squares are usually multiple colors. So if one is a slightly different blue, it doesn't matter. But I'm a plus size person. If I was making a garment, I would not like it to suddenly be a different blue at like a random spot on my chest or something like that that I didn't pick, right? So in that case, I would be very concerned about the dye lots. So think about the project. Is it solid color or is it striped or are there motifs? So if the color is being broken up in some way, you may not be as concerned. But if it's a solid color, especially for a garment, I think I would be super concerned about matching the dye lots.
We have one more question. We're going to stop it there since we're at time. So Barbara's just asking, do you have any notes about linen yarn?
I didn't mention linen yarn because I personally have not come across it as much as some of these other fibers. There is more linen and hemp and other natural fiber yarns now, but it still doesn't seem to be as common as these other fibers, which is why I didn't talk about it. It's a plant-based yarn. It's, like all the plant-based yarns, it's more breathable than some other synthetic yarns. But as far as the yarns, I've seen it mostly in a lot of blends where the percentage of linen is fairly low. So I don't have a lot of experience with it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Marie. Thank you for this fantastic presentation. If folks are not following Marie on her social media channels already, please do. And I'm going to drop that link again to subscribe to Marie's newsletter, and you can get those freebies that she talked about. If you have any questions about Favecraft Studio Live, you can email me directly at dneald@primecp.com. And Marie, anything else before we take off?
No, just want to mention that I have an annual um, Christmas in July make-along that kicks off next week. So if you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get all of those patterns. It's a daily pattern that you can crochet, knit, or sew for holiday gifts. So for those folks who like to get a head start, it's a good way to do that.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you so much again for doing today's class, and everybody's commenting. Thank you. It was super helpful. Lots to digest, which is awesome. So
Yeah, thank you everybody for being such a great audience. And thanks, Dana, for
of
hosting.
course. Yeah, of course. All right. Well, have a good rest of your day, and thank you again.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.